Every Christian knows the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's completely wrong.
This video offers an important lesson.
All right, let's see it.
It's spoken with confidence, it sounds compelling, but it's completely false. And sadly, many people aren't going to take the time to closely examine its claims. That's why Proverbs 18:17 warns us, the first to state his case seems right until another comes and cross-examines him. In other words, just because someone sounds persuasive doesn't mean they are. So let's take a closer look at some of this creator's claims and see if it holds up under cross-examination.
Yes, let's.
The four Gospels were written between 70 and 100 CE by anonymous authors. We know this because the earliest manuscripts don't include any names, no titles, no Gospel according to, just a story starting mid-scene with no author attached.
Before we get to the response, I would just point out that I think this is a bit of an exaggeration.
That's a pretty confident claim. It sounds so matter-of-fact, but it's not true. In his paper, The Titles of the Gospels in the Early New Testament Manuscripts, scholar Simon Gathercole shows that the earliest Greek manuscripts do include titles, what are called superscriptions, that attribute the Gospels to either Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. When asked about the titles during a lecture, Gathercole says,
"Yeah, I don't think that they are attached later, because all the earliest manuscript evidence that we have, where we have an end or a beginning of a gospel, has the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John."
Scholar Brant Petrie put it even more forcefully. He says there's absolutely no manuscript evidence to support the claim that originally the Gospels had no title.
So Gathercole and Petrie are simply wrong. We have an early manuscript that preserves the very beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, and there is no title on the page. This is Papyrus 1, also known as P1 or P-Oxy 1.2. Here is that page, and you can see at the very top in the middle an alpha. That is a page number. And then under that you see Vivlos Geneseos Jesu Christou. This is the book of the generation of Jesus Christ. This is the very beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, and there is no title to be found. Now, you'll notice that it is somewhat fragmentary, and so some people will argue, oh, well, there was a title, it was above the page number. If so, this would be the only manuscript known from early Christianity that does that, because the page number is metadata, it is paratextual, it is not part of the text, it does not interrupt the text. They are always in the top margin, either in the center or on the side. And you can look at the other side of this manuscript page, and I've circled it in red because it's a little hard to see, but that's the beta that is just above the text as it continues on from the first page. And when we do have a title that occurs along with a centered page number, the page number goes on top. Now, there are some apologists who will argue that we have examples of page numbers coming under the titles. This is simply false. And those apologists will generally appeal to Codex Vaticanus, as you see here, and Codex Sinaiticus, as you can with a little more difficulty see here. And what they will argue is that that alpha that we see on the left margins represents a page number that is occurring under the title. And this is a bafflingly bad argument for a number of reasons. First, this is not centered. This is not occurring underneath the title, interrupting the flow of the text. This is in the left margins. Second, these aren't page numbers. These are Eusebian canons, early kind of proto-chapter verse divisions, because if you zoom out and look at the whole page, that alpha is followed up by a beta, and then a gamma, and then a delta, and then an epsilon. The same is true of Codex Sinaiticus. That alpha is followed up by a beta, and then a gamma and a delta, one after the other, and then an epsilon. These are not page numbers. They are not occurring underneath the title in the manuscript. So that apologetic defense is just absolutely laughable. The simple fact is that we have an early Greek New Testament manuscript preserving the very beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, and there is no title.
But don't take my word for it. See for yourself. Here's P75, one of the earliest substantial manuscripts of Luke and John, dated late 2nd or early 3rd century. And what do we see? At the end of Luke and the beginning of John, we have the titles, the Gospel according to Luke and the Gospel according to John.
So I'm going to interrupt briefly to talk about why apologists are so keen on asserting the dates of these manuscripts and why they will always lean into the earliest plausible date and ignore the evidence to the contrary. The critical view is that the authorship of the Gospels slowly developed, particularly with Papias' statement about a gospel written by Matthew and a gospel written by Mark in the early 2nd century CE, but weren't really assigned on the manuscripts until like 160, 170 CE. And the idea is that there was probably a manuscript that contained all 4 gospels that assigned authorship and titles, and that manuscript was probably produced in Rome and then began to circulate out and was considered to be authoritative, was considered to be accurate, and everybody just adopted that authorship that was first asserted by that manuscript. And this would have been, again, around 160, 170 CE. So if we date this particular manuscript to the late 2nd, early 3rd century CE, that's just after this is supposed to have happened. And if we have multiple different attestations to these titles and this assignment of authorship, then we can say it's unlikely that it would have spread so far and wide and be so consistently represented after only a decade or two. And that is leaning into the early parts of that chronological window of late 2nd to early 3rd century CE. So the earlier we can date these manuscripts that have these titles, the less plausible the critical perspective on the development of the authorship of the Gospels will sound. The problem is these early dates are not very likely. And to show this, I'm going to point to a book called God's Library, The Archaeology of the Earliest Christian Manuscripts by Brent Nongbury. If you want to know an awful lot more about how manuscripts are dated, I highly recommend this book. But I want to talk about this particular manuscript that was just shown with the end of the Gospel of Luke and the beginning of the Gospel of John. This is also known as P. Bodmer 14 through 15. And in the red box here, you see both P. Bodmer 14 through 15, Gospels according to Luke and John, and P. Bodmer 24 Psalms have been assigned dates as early as the 2nd century solely on the basis of their handwriting. But again, there is reason to distrust such early datings. In addition to the fact that codices of a very similar format and construction technique are known to have been produced in the 4th century, the handwriting of P. Bodmer 14 through 15 has close parallels among samples that can be securely dated to the 4th century. Figure 5.6 provides a side-by-side comparison of P. Bodmer 14 through 15 with samples from 2 letters from an archive of the first half of the 4th century. And if you get the book, you can look, he's comparing a bunch of words and stuff like that to show that paleographically they are very, very close. The stakes for trying to obtain a proper date for this particular manuscript are quite high. Textual critics of the New Testament have described this manuscript as the most significant New Testament papyrus so far discovered, largely because of the early date assigned to it by its original editors and the fact that its text is very much like that of the Codex Vaticanus, and also it attests to these titles. When it was published and believed to be as old as the late 2nd century, P. Bodmer 14 through 15 was thought to overturn the commonly held opinion that the 2nd and 3rd centuries were a period when the text of the New Testament was relatively fluid and unstable. Yet, in terms of its format, construction, and handwriting, P. Bodmer 14 through 15 is at home in the 4th century with many of the other Bodmer papyri. As far as the date of the Psalms Codex, we may be able to have a firmer knowledge in the near future, as I am informed that this book has been subjected to radiocarbon analysis by its new owners, and the results will soon be published. Those results were published a few years later, and we can look at the table showing the results for this particular Psalms manuscript, and as Nongbury points out in a later publication, the papyrus of this Psalms manuscript was harvested somewhere between 230 and 320 CE, which means it's more like mid to late 3rd century or early 4th century, because the text cannot have been written on this papyrus prior to the harvesting of this papyrus. And this fits better with the paleographic comparisons with other texts that are much more securely dated to the 4th century CE. So this is actually very unlikely to be late 2nd century. At best, maybe early 3rd century. And the likelihood that a manuscript from 160, 170 CE with authorship newly assigned could proliferate and could spread that authorship far and wide in that amount of time is much more likely.
Here's P4, again, late 2nd or early 3rd century. It contains the Gospel according to Matthew.
So a couple of problems with appealing to this manuscript. First, again, dating. This is almost certainly not late 2nd century or early 3rd century. And again, you can go to Nongbri's book. His last chapter is entitled Fabricating a 2nd Century Codex of the Four Gospels, and it is precisely a discussion of the larger codex in which this manuscript was found. It was incorporated into the binding of this larger codex which contained the works of Philo of Alexandria, and also incorporated into the binding were fragments of the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. Now, here's the thing to note about the manuscript. This is what is known as a flyleaf, a separate page on which something is written, because it appears to be just the title, Gospel according to Matthew, on an otherwise empty page. And a lot of scholars think that this was the title page for the Gospel of Matthew, the fragments of which were also discovered incorporated into the binding of this codex. However, the scribal hand on this flyleaf is not the scribal hand responsible for the Gospel of Matthew as found in those fragments. So if it is the title page for that manuscript of the Gospel of Matthew, it is a secondary addition, meaning it is something somebody added to a gospel that otherwise lacked a title, and it was written by a different scribe. So this is not evidence that all of the earliest manuscripts contain titles. This might be evidence that this particular manuscript, the fragments of which were discovered in this codex, didn't have a title, just like Papyrus 1.
Maybe he's thinking of P66, one of the oldest copies of John's Gospel, around 200 AD. Nope, there's another title.
Well, let's do what this content creator suggests we do at the beginning of this video and dig a little deeper into these claims. Let's look at Gathercole's discussion from his article on gospel titles. At the bottom of the page in the red box, the only title of any kind which survives is the introductory title to John's Gospel, indented at the very top of the surviving text. It is probably written in the same hand as the main body of the text, though was perhaps added later, as it might not be part of the natural layout of the page. In other words, the scribe may have written either that page or the entire manuscript and then come back and added the title at the very top of the page. We're not sure, but while this is evidence of a title very early on in the transmission of this manuscript, it could also be evidence that the title was something secondary, something that might not have been in the source text. So this is not nearly as secure as these apologists would like it to be. And again, contrary to the very confident assertion of this content creator and Gathercole and Petrie, we absolutely have manuscript evidence of a gospel lacking a title.
So where did the names come from? In the 2nd century, as different Christian groups were battling over which stories about Jesus were legit, church leaders needed to draw lines, which gospels had authority and which did not. Their solution? Attach big names to the anonymous text they wanted to promote.
Here we're given another claim without evidence to try to make sense of a former claim that had no evidence. But let's imagine, for the sake of the argument, the Gospels were originally anonymous, but later on Christians conspired to deceive the masses and falsely attribute them to give them more authority.
So while I would quibble with Elon's claims, I think that this representation of the story is straw-manning Elon a bit, but it's definitely straw-manning what I understand to be the critical position, which is not that a bunch of Christians conspired to deceive the masses, but that someone in Rome around 160, 170 CE decided to start attributing authorship to the Gospels, not because they wanted to deceive anybody, but because they were aware of tradition circulating about who authored these Gospels. And so while they were circulating anonymously, somebody probably thought, well, why not add titles or the authors to these Gospels and did so. That's neither conspiracy nor deception.
Okay, why choose Mark and Luke? You've got 11 actual disciples to choose from. If you're making stuff up, why not choose Peter or Philip or Thomas or even Jesus himself? If you're inventing names, you don't settle for Peter's interpreter or Paul's traveling companion. You choose big names that carry authority.
But choosing Mark and Luke is representing the big names. The most important leaders of the early Jesus movement, apart from James, who died too early to be responsible for one of these Gospels, were Peter, Paul, and John. Now, we have a Gospel assigned to John, and so that just leaves Peter and Paul. But Peter was not known to be a man of letters. Nobody would have taken seriously the notion that he actually wrote this Gospel in Greek. Additionally, there was already a pseudepigraphic Gospel of Peter in circulation that a lot of people rejected, and you did not want to confuse this Gospel with that one. And so the next best thing to assigning the authorship of this Gospel to Peter would be assigning it to his interpreter, which is what Papias does in the early 2nd century CE. So that covers the base of the testimony of Peter. And when it comes to Luke, assigning authorship to Luke is a way to represent the testimony of the other main leader of the early Christian movement, namely Paul. Now, Luke and Acts clearly were not written by Paul. The author identifies as someone distinct from Paul, but also someone who had a lot of access to Paul. Since Luke was one of Paul's main traveling companions, it makes a lot of sense to assign authorship to Luke, and in that way represent the testimony of Paul.
Interestingly, that's exactly what the apocryphal Gospels do, like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary. They attach the big famous names to give credibility.
And this is one of the pitfalls of pseudepigrapha, is when you say, oh, this was written by Enoch, by an illiterate Peter, by Mary Magdalene, you're making ridiculous claims, which is why it was more credible to say, oh, it was written by Peter's interpreter, oh, it was written by Paul's traveling companion.
So ironically, names like Mark and Luke point towards authenticity, not against it.
And now you've stumbled upon the reason that that assignment of authorship took root quickly and was widely considered authoritative and accurate.
Matthew and John, two of Jesus' apostles. Mark, supposedly Peter's interpreter. Luke, Paul's travel companion. It was genius-level religious branding, but the evidence doesn't back it up.
Actually, the evidence overwhelmingly does back it up.
No, it doesn't.
That's why the early church fathers were unanimous in attributing the four Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and no one else. Think about why this matters. If the Gospels started out anonymous and then were copied and circulated and recopied and copied again and circulated for decades around the Roman Empire, from Judea to Rome to Egypt to France, then here's the question. How did the scribes and early church fathers conspire to unanimously attribute all the Gospels to the exact same four names? No confusion, no disagreement, no debate. That's not how anonymous documents work.
So this is probably the strongest part of this whole argument, but it's still not all that strong, because there was some nuance to anonymity, and you have folks like Justin Martyr, who's perfectly happy to just say, oh, the memoirs of the apostles, and not go any further than that. And if people are happy with that anonymity, all it would take to authoritatively establish authorship is for a manuscript to begin to circulate that assigns authorship to all four Gospels in ways that intuitively make sense. And if you are representing the testimonies of the main leaders of the early Christian movement, either directly as in the case of John or indirectly as in the case of Mark to Peter and Luke to Paul, then that is a very intuitive claim to authorship that's going to make sense, and that, as long as it comes out of Rome and is thought to be authoritative, is not going to be challenged.
We know this because we have the book of Hebrews, which is genuinely anonymous. Notice how there's a lot of debate and disagreement over its authorship. Was it Paul or Barnabas or Luke or Clement or someone else? We just don't know. So if the Gospels were truly anonymous, we should see this kind of debate early on, but we don't. Incredibly, we see uniform and unanimous agreement.
So this is a bit misleading. You will not have debates about authorship until you have proposals about authorship. And if proposals are widely accepted, then you will have no debates. It is when proposals are not widely accepted, and usually because they are considered implausible, that you have debates. The earliest people to assign authorship to Hebrews suggested Paul wrote it, and that was not considered a plausible proposal, because Hebrews is clearly not coming from the same author that wrote Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians and the genuine Pauline epistles. You had debates precisely because the initial proposals were not considered plausible. And this is why you didn't want to say that the Gospel of Mark was written by Peter, because that would have been considered implausible. Then you would have had debates. So the fact that Mark and Luke were assigned authorship of the Gospels that were supposed to represent the testimonies of Peter and Paul is one reason you don't have widespread debate. That was considered plausible. So again, you don't have debates about authorship unless you have proposals about authorship. And if you have a proposal that is considered plausible and acceptable and authoritative, then there's no reason to expect debates.
Take Matthew. The author writes in polished Greek, copies most of Mark, and clearly doesn't know Judean geography.
So I'm going to jump in to say I think Elon is confusing Mark for Matthew, because it is Mark that many scholars suggest is making errors about geography in this territory. Matthew is actually improving upon Mark's understanding of the geography, and while there are some arguments that Matthew is misrepresenting some things here and there, it is not nearly as pronounced as Mark, and is probably not definitive when it comes to whether or not Matthew could have been authored by someone who knew that territory well.
Would the actual disciple need to plagiarize someone else's account?
All right, a couple things. First, Matthew's previous profession was a tax collector, making it very likely that he could read and write in Greek, the primary language of commerce at the time.
This is accurate, and this is one of the reasons that the assignment of authorship to Matthew would not have been challenged.
Second, if the Gospel of Mark was directly based on the testimony of the Apostle Peter, who was both a leader of the 12 and an eyewitness to more of Jesus' ministry than Matthew, then there's nothing unreasonable about Matthew using Mark as a reliable source.
So this is not a very thoughtful or strong argument. To begin, Matthew's main source is Mark. If Matthew were written by the disciple named Matthew and were an eyewitness to the overwhelming majority of what happened during Jesus' life, he would not be leaning on the Gospel of Matthew as his main source. But additionally, Matthew borrows an awful lot of stuff from Mark and changes it. Now, you might say, well, certainly the disciple might have remembered things differently. Great, except a lot of the things that Matthew borrows from Mark are things that Mark describes as only being witnessed by Peter, James, and John, like the transfiguration, like the raising of the daughter of Jairus. But when Matthew borrows those things from Mark, Matthew changes them. So this would be someone who did not witness these events, borrowing the account of those events from someone who did witness them, and then altering them. So this doesn't make a lot of sense as an eyewitness using another eyewitness as a supplement to their own testimony. This makes a lot more sense as a literary creation based on another literary creation that is altering things in order to serve their own rhetorical goals.
All right, his video goes on to raise some other points, but rather than continue a point-by-point refutation and turning this into a longer response, I just want to encourage you to watch his video and then go read Brant Petree's book, The Case for Jesus. If you want to thoughtfully engage challenges, you can't just watch videos on social media. You need to challenge yourself to think more deeply about these ideas, and this book is a good place to start. Class dismissed.
No, class is not dismissed yet. If you want to better understand these things, retreating to apologetic publications is not going to help. Read some critical scholarship. Read Nongbri's God's Library to better understand the history behind the manuscripts of the New Testament, as well as the variety of claims that have been made over the years and what the data actually support. If all you're doing is retreating to pre-digested apologetics, you're not getting the data, you're just getting the dogma. And before I let you go, finally, as always, learn to think critically and Google competently. And the fit for this video has been Bluey.